Welcome back to Organize, the Business Law Breakdown. I'm your host, Seth C. Orenberg, and today we're exploring a concept in contract law that might seem a little unexpected. It's called promissory restitution, and it's an idea that revolves around getting something back, even when a contract wasn't in place at the time. So, when is it payback time? Imagine this. Someone provides you with a benefit, like medical treatment when you're unconscious, or paying off a debt for you and you didn't ask for it. Later, you promise to pay them back. Is that promise enforceable, even though there was no contract and no consideration when the benefit was provided? We've previously learned that past consideration is not consideration. Today, we're breaking down the idea of promissory restitution and understanding why the law might step in to enforce promises that follow the receipt of a benefit. In our previous episode, we covered promissory estoppel, where the law enforces promises based on reliance. But today we're delving into a different kind of promise, the kind that comes after someone has received a benefit and they later promise to pay for it. This is where promissory restitution comes into play. We'll explore what promissory restitution is, how it works, and why courts sometimes enforce promises made after an action is taken. We'll also look at key cases like Webb v. McGowin, where a promise to pay someone for a life-saving act was enforced, even though the promise was made well after the life-saving act was concluded. Before we get started, let's identify 3 key takeaways you'll gain from listening to this episode. You'll learn how promissory restitution allows a party to recover for benefits conferred, even when there was no formal contract or prior agreement in place. We'll explore how courts use promissory restitution to prevent unjust enrichment, ensuring that one party is not unfairly enriched at the expense of another. And finally, we'll discuss the limits of promissory restitution and when courts may decline to enforce it, focusing on situations where a party voluntarily confers a benefit without an expectation of payment. So, if you've ever wondered whether a promise to pay someone back is enforceable, even when there wasn't an agreement beforehand, stick around. We're about to dive deep into the world of promissory restitution and the obligations that can arise after a benefit has been conferred. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the elements of promissory restitution. Promissory restitution comes into play when someone receives a benefit, makes a promise to pay for it later, and justice requires enforcement of that promise, despite there being no contract when that benefit was originally provided. Promissory restitution is all about fairness. It prevents unjust enrichment by holding people accountable for promises they've made after they've received benefit. The legal theory is that even though there wasn't an agreement at the time the benefit was conferred, the promise to pay later can still be enforced if it would be unjust for the recipient to keep the benefits without compensation. This concept often comes up in situations where someone receives a service or benefit unexpectedly, like in emergency situations where there's no time to negotiate a contract, but the recipient later agrees to pay. For example, if someone steps in to save your life or property, and afterwards you promise to compensate them, that promise may be enforceable under promissory restitution. Let's spell out the elements, because courts require a few key elements before enforcing a promise under promissory restitution. One is benefit. The recipient must receive some type of material benefit. That is what is going to be disgorged later, the value of that benefit. So if there's no benefit, there's no amount or item to be disgorged. That was the amount of unjust enrichment. So the benefit is key because that's the degree to which there is some unjust enrichment without enforcement. Element 2, the promise. Every contract and every non-contractual promise requires a promise for enforcement. If there's no promise, maybe there's some other area of law that enforces this particular situation and requires a remedy, but in this course, everything requires a promise. In this case, the promise is at a weird point in time. The second element, the promise, comes after the benefit was conferred. We would typically call this past consideration. And if you go back to the episode on consideration, you will recall that past consideration, quote unquote, is not consideration. But here, it can be the basis for promissory restitution. Element 3, it would be unfair for the recipient to retain the benefit without compensating the person who provided it. Fairness requires disgorgement of the benefit from the person who received it to the promisee, the person who receives the promise. Let's take a look at a well-known case, and hopefully that will make this more clear. A well-known case is Webb v. McGowin. In this case, Webb saved McGowan's life by risking his own, and in saving the life to another, he received serious injuries to his own person, disabling him for life. Afterwards, McGowin, who was saved, promised to pay Webb, the savior, a monthly sum for the rest of his life in recognition of what Webb had done for McGowin. Even though there was no contract at the time of the life-saving act, and how could there be? It happened in a split second in an emergency. The court enforced the promise because Webb had provided a material benefit by saving McGowan's life, and it would be unjust for McGowin to keep the benefit without paying what he promised for it. Effectively, instead of enforcing this like a contract, it was enforced like a type of limited disgorgement of a value of the benefit, which was set by the promise. To sum up, promissory restitution is the legal principle that steps in to enforce promises made after the fact when someone has received a benefit, even if there wasn't a formal agreement beforehand. It's designed to ensure fairness and prevent unjust enrichment. Now that we've covered the basics, let's take a deep dive to see how courts apply this doctrine. Let's start by breaking it down with a foundational case that illustrates the general rule regarding past consideration. As mentioned earlier, past consideration, quote unquote, is not consideration. It doesn't count. And in general, a promise to pay for something that happened in the past is unenforceable. And let's see that in the famous case of Mills v. Wyman. Mills v. Wyman is a prime example of courts usually deal with promises made after a benefit has been conferred, which is to say, they usually dismiss the case. In the case of Mills v. Wyman, Mills cared for Wyman's adult son during his son's illness. The son passed away, and after his son's death, when there was no more care to give, Wyman promised to pay Mills for his trouble. However, Wyman later refused to follow through on that promise, and Mills sued. The court ruled the promise was not enforceable. Even though Mills had provided valuable services, the promise to pay was made after the fact. The key issue was that past consideration, a promise to pay for something that has already been given, is generally not considered valid consideration in contract law. A benefit provided before a promise is made doesn't create a binding obligation. The court emphasized that because the benefit was conferred on Wyman's son and not Wyman himself, and it was an adult son, so there was no obligation to care for the child, and the promise was made after the benefit, there was no legal obligation to enforce the promise. This is the general rule. Past consideration, quote unquote, is not enough to make a promise enforceable. Mills v. Wyman shows that courts won't enforce promises that are made after the fact unless certain exceptions apply. Here, the court did not find that Wyman was unjustly enriched, and thus the promise to pay Mills was not enforceable. Now that we've established the general rule that past consideration is not consideration, let's explore when past consideration can count as consideration under the doctrine of promissory restitution. Let's discuss a what if. Imagine your friend takes care of your pet gerbil while you're away on vacation without you asking them to do so. When you return, feeling grateful, you promise to give them $500 as a thank you for their gerbil-related help. Later, you decide not to pay. Is your promise to pay for care of your gerbil enforceable? No, probably not. The situation is very similar to Mills v. Wyman, although there is one major difference. The help your friend gave was past consideration. It was done before the promise was made. Courts generally won't enforce a promise based on past actions because no contract existed at the time of the benefit. So in this case, your friend wouldn't be able to enforce the promise. However, if the friend could prove that that care was required for the gerbil to live and that the gerbil had some value, and this is your personal property to which you have maybe an ethical and perhaps legal responsibility, if the friend saved you from legal trouble, we might be pushing into a different case, which we'll see next, where this promise could be enforceable. But if this was just playing with the gerbil to keep your gerbil happy while you were gone on vacation, this was probably not an enforceable promise. Let's explore another what if. What if, instead of simply taking care of your gerbil, your friend went above and beyond, saving your gerbil from a life-threatening situation by rushing your sick gerbil to the vet, paying for medical care, and staying up all night to nurse your gerbil back to health. Afterwards, feeling indebted, you promise to pay them back for the vet bills and compensate them for their effort. Would that change things? Still, the general rule of past consideration applies. Look, the promise was made after the fact, so it's probably not enforceable as a matter of contract law. But as a matter of restitution, your friend provided a significant, tangible benefit, and he did so in an emergency situation. So here we're getting closer to a situation where we are more likely to find promissory restitution is available. Let's take this what if a step further. What if your friend's actions didn't just involve caring for your pet, but saving your house from fire at great personal risk? What if the situation was more dire, and instead of simply caring for your gerbil, while being there, they noticed an electrical spark that ignited your home? They saved your gerbil and many of your favorite possessions, including your photo album of your gerbil from birth, and they also saved your house from burning down. Afterwards, out of gratitude, you promised to pay the medical bills for the injuries that your friend suffered and monthly support. Could that be enforceable? Again, as the situation becomes more dire and extreme, we're getting closer to the Webb v. McGowin case and further from the Mills v. Wyman case. Again, Mills v. Wyman, there was no promissory restitution, and in Webb v. McGowin, there was. So we want to use analogy and distinction to figure out where we are on that line. In this case, your friend provided a huge material benefit, saving your property and potentially your life by remedying a dangerous situation in your home, all while incurring serious harm to themselves. The promise to pay after such an extraordinary act, where the benefit was so significant, could be enforceable under promissory restitution. Courts might find it unjust for you to keep the benefit without compensating your friend, much like they did in Webb v. McGowin. So, as we've seen, the general rule is past consideration doesn't count, and that's from Mills v. Wyman. But there are exceptional cases where the nature of the benefit is so substantial that courts will enforce the promise, as we see in Webb v. McGowin. So let's break it down with Webb v. McGowin. I've really hyped up this case, so let's break it down and get into the extraordinary exception of Webb v. McGowin. This case demonstrates how a promise based on past consideration can be enforced when the benefit is significant and life-changing. In this case, Webb was working in a lumber mill and saved McGowan's life by diverting a falling block of wood. In the process, Webb was severely injured, suffering permanent disabilities. After realizing the magnitude of what Webb had done, McGowin promised to pay Webb a monthly sum for the rest of his life. For years, McGowin kept the promise, but after he died, the estate refused to pay, and Webb sued the estate to enforce the promise. The key issue here is whether McGowan's promise to pay Webb, which was made after the benefit was conferred, is enforceable. The court ruled in Webb's favor, applying the newly founded doctrine of promissory restitution. They found that Webb's act of saving McGowan's life was a substantial material benefit, and it would have been unjust for McGowan's estate to keep that benefit without compensating Webb. Unlike in Mills v. Wyman, where the benefit wasn't seen as material to the promisor, Webb v. McGowin stands as an exception. The court enforced the promise because Webb's life-saving actions provided McGowin with a direct benefit so significant that the promise to pay afterwards was considered valid and enforceable. Through this case, we see that while the general rule is past consideration doesn't count, there are exceptions where the benefit is so extraordinary that fairness demands the promise be enforced. The key factor is whether it would be unjust for the recipient of the benefit to avoid compensating the person who provided it. Now that we've broken down how Webb v. McGowin contrasts with the general rule in Mills v. Wyman, let's take a moment to explore how the doctrine of promissory restitution shows up in the world of pop culture. You might not realize it, but the concept of receiving a benefit and later being expected to pay for it appears more often in the movies and TV than you think. Take the movie Saving Private Ryan, for instance. While there's no explicit contract in this movie, this idea is clear. Captain Miller and his men risked their lives to save Private Ryan, bringing him out of harm's way during World War II. In the end, Private Ryan reflects on whether he's earned the sacrifice that was made for him, symbolizing the immense value of the benefit he received. Although there's no formal promise for compensation, the movie explores the moral implications of receiving life-altering benefits without giving something in return, a theme closely related to the doctrine of promissory restitution. Another interesting example comes from The Godfather. When Don Corleone helps others, there's often an implicit understanding they owe him a favor in return. Even if the promise of repayment comes much later, these favors are based on past benefits conferred, and while the legal doctrine explicitly discussed, and where it would be difficult to enforce mob-related promises in courts, the dynamic often mirrors the way promissory restitution might operate when someone receives a benefit and is later expected to compensate for it. Whether in war films like Saving Private Ryan or mafia stories like The Godfather, we see a recurring theme with people receiving life-changing benefits and feeling obligated to repay for them. Promissory restitution in many ways captures this principle in the real world, where significant benefits create legal obligations even if a formal contract wasn't in place at the time. Let's wrap up our episode with a recap of what we've covered today. We started by exploring the general rule that past consideration isn't enforceable, as illustrated in Mills v. Wyman. In that case, the court refused to enforce a promise made after a benefit had been conferred because it wasn't tied to a formal agreement or legal obligation at the time. Then we contrasted that with Webb v. McGowin, where the court enforced a promise based on past consideration due to the extraordinary nature of the benefit Webb provided and the promise to pay for it afterwards. Webb's life-saving actions were so substantial that fairness required McGowin to compensate him, even though his promise came later. The key takeaway is that while past consideration usually doesn't count as consideration, there are exceptions where the benefit is so significant that courts will enforce a promise made after the fact. Promissory restitution exists to prevent unjust enrichment and ensure that those who receive life-altering benefits aren't left without an obligation to repay when they make promises to pay for them. Have you ever made a promise after receiving help from someone? Or do you know of situations where someone felt obligated to repay a significant favor that you did? I'd love to hear your stories, thoughts, or questions. Share them with me, and I may discuss them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with anyone who's interested in learning more about business law. In our next episode, we'll dive into the doctrine of unjust enrichment and how the law steps in when one party benefits at the expense of another without a formal. That's all for today's episode, Contract. I'm Seth C. Orenberg, and I thank you for contemplating the doctrine of promissory restitution with me today. I hope you found it informative and helpful. And remember, keep your agreement strong and your argument stronger.